the Conservatives have released their costed platform. Voters now have a sense of how all the major parties are going to pay for the promises they've made during the campaign. Does all the math, however, add up? Economist and fellow resident at C.D. Howe Institute, Don Drummond, is with me now. He spent 23 years in the Department of Finance helping shape Canada's fiscal policy. Hi, Mr. Drummond. Thank you so much for making the time.
Hey, you're welcome.
I appreciate it. I wanted to start off, I was reading through your analysis of kind of in the aggregate, the platforms that have been put forward. And one of the first lines that you wrote jumped out to me, that basically we have some clarity on what they're going to do around the economy, but that the quote clarity does little to diminish our concerns. Why have you reached that conclusion?
I think in Canada, we're in a very serious economic position. Of late, our GDP output per capita, so what we get per person, is just flatlined. All our growth has come from population. We've had a miserable productivity growth rate since around 2000, and it's just gotten worse. We have far less capital per worker than other countries. We, of course, now realize it was a terrible mistake to allow ourselves to be so dependent upon the U.S. economy. 3/4 of our exports going there. We needed to do bold, creative, new things to do that. The Conservatives and the Liberals have some ideas to bolster economic growth. They're not particularly creative. They're not particularly bold. So disappointed on that front. And we have a very vulnerable fiscal position. We've been in these 50 billion plus deficits for some time. We have a net debt-to-GDP ratio of over 40%. And basically, if you update the Liberal and the Conservative numbers and look at the NDP number, update it for the tariff impact, they're basically saying we're just going to lock in the inadequate, vulnerable fiscal position we've had. There's no balance in the budget, and the Conservatives, as they said that they were going to do, there's no keeping the deficit under 1% of GDP, as the Liberals said they would do. The numbers don't add up to those commitments. And at the end of it, they don't take much out of spending. And particularly the surprise is on the Conservative side. Out of roughly $500 billion of spending, excluding interest on the public debt, they're only proposing to take out about $10 billion a year. And in just one narrow category, contract budgets. The rest of it gets a free ride.
Why does the fiscal position of the federal government matter in layman's terms? And I ask you because the parties appear to have reached a political consensus that there's more to lose politically in this election by focusing on fiscal restraint, or even, you know, a more balanced fiscal position than there is to be gained by keeping a lot of the spending that you just outlined. Like, why does it matter to Canadians if there is, you know, some attention paid to our fiscal position?
So one of the ways it shows up is a portion of the money you send through your taxes to Ottawa. How much of that goes to come back to things that Canadians want and need, old age security payments, employment insurance, defense, and how much of it goes to pay on the interest in the public debt? Just as a household, that interest in the public debt is not giving anybody any service tomorrow. That's paying on things we consumed from the past. And as that ratio rises, the taxpayers' money goes to less and less. And already we have over 10% of everything Canadians send to the federal government just literally gets burned on interest in the public debt. In the mid-1990s, it hit as high as 30%. I'm not saying we're at that crisis level, but it slowly drains the possibility of funding the things that people want. It needs to be paid back. It's a very unfair intergenerational burden. Particularly the debt run-up that was incurred during COVID, those actions benefited Canadians of the day, and they should be paying it back over a period of time. But basically, it's being bundled up, put away to the side for the moment, and is saying some young people or even a future generation will have to pay that, but they're going to have their own needs. And particularly at a time where we've got this aging of the Canadian population, a doubling of the 65 plus in the next 20 years, a tripling of the 75 plus population, that we're going to need the resources to be able to offer people the public services they want and need at a low tax rate. And you can't do that when you've got these big debt ratios. The problem is it doesn't all blow apart in a day, but it steadily chokes the economy and people's finances.
I wanted to ask you on each of the Liberals and the Conservatives, to reality check, I guess, one key part of the fiscal framework they put forward. For the Conservatives, in their release of the platform today, the reason why there isn't more spending cuts to achieve ultimately the position that they lay out is because they are very much banking on increases to the revenue of the federal government based on economic growth. So like taking away regulations, taking away C-69, incentivizing house building, that will all, according to this document, greatly benefit federal coffers. Is there a way to seriously, know exactly what that outcome will be and to build it into your budget the way they have?
Yeah, first, before getting into that, I should note both the Liberals and the Conservatives use a set of economic and fiscal assumptions given to them by the Parliamentary Budget Office, which was done in March, and it doesn't include any negative effects from the U.S. tariffs, the Canadian retaliation, and this dark, dark cloud of uncertainty hanging over the Canadian and global economy. If I just take one outfit's adjustment of what that would do to these fiscal outlooks, it would add over $11 billion a year by 2027 to their fiscal outlook. So they already got released in the case of the Conservatives this morning, but they're already out of date. Actually, the NDP actually, I think, very sensibly used the economic scenarios in the Bank of Canada's April 2025 monetary policy report. It does address explicitly the damage, so we have to add a buffer to what we're seeing there. Yes, this accounting for the induced effects is very unusual. I worked on budgets for 23 years. There was rarely a budget the politicians didn't want to include those. I think we succeeded more often than not in not putting them in. There's one old chestnut that came up all the time, is that we're going to tell the CRA to be tougher on tax compliance and crack down on tax havens, and let's count a couple of $1 billion flowing from that. But your question is spot on. Could I or you or anybody in 5 years' time and look up in the public accounts and say, yep, they got it, or they didn't get it, or they got more of it? No way. You will never know. These things never produce the kind of revenue they're doing it. Reducing the regulation, first you got to do it, and there's not even a description of the process we're going to do it. You have to have the economic effect. We have no idea what kind of economic activity, and we will never be able to measure it ex post. So I say, those should be kept out of fiscal documents. I did my best when I was at finance to make sure they didn't get in there.
Final question for you, Mr. Drummond, is to reality check the Liberals. One of their key kind of assumptions that they put forward, or not even assumptions, just structural changes. They've separated out what they're calling a capital budget from an operational budget, and therefore able to say, oh, we are cutting spending on one side, and sort of it doesn't count as spending if it's investment in something like a hospital or even more broad. I don't even know what else it could encompass, actually, because we don't even have all the details. What do you think of that practice?
I tend to ignore it. First of all, capital spending, infrastructure is good. We need more. We definitely need the transportation mean to get our products to ports and get them to countries other than the United States. But we've always separated that. We've always been able to see what we spend there. Whether they're creating a new concept of an operating deficit and a capital budget really means nothing to me, because with one little calculation, you've always been able to determine. The bottom line is that they are continuing to run about $50 billion deficits, and if you adjust for the tariff effect, they'd be over $60 billion. That's 1.67% of GDP, whereas they said they were going to keep it under 1%. But so I don't just leave it a negative on the Liberals. The Conservatives said they're going to balance the budget. Their plan doesn't come close, doesn't include that tariff effect, and they've got this creative accounting on all these induced revenues. So all the political parties just project big deficits and a lot of debt going forward with lots of spending.
Well, I appreciate your factual analysis this evening. Thanks very much for making the time, Mr. Drummond.
You're welcome. Bye.